I'm Colin Williams, Programme Director of the Real Life Leadership Programme, and I'm here to chat with Alex Steele about the parallels between leadership in an organisation or a business and in the world of jazz. And Alex is both a jazz musician and an academic, so has an interesting perspective on both. So we'll start by exploring a couple of the ideas in the Living Leadership book, the Get Connected, Get Real and Get Help. I have a sense of what that means in the world of organisation. What does that mean in your world?
First of all, to say that I like the book very much, and for me it reflects most of what happens in the jazz world, but specifically I'm talking about the way that musicians interact together. And I think you were talking about Get Connected as the first strong theme, and clearly jazz can only work when four people are interacting, having a conversation. And from my perspective, because I guess people that watch jazz or listen to this conversation don't particularly know, may not even like jazz. Yeah. But jazz is quite different to other genres of music in that it is mostly improvised. So when in a quartet four people come together, you're witnessing them having a conversation. Jazz is, if you like, is a language of its own, with its own vocabulary and its own grammar. And the musicians come together and have a conversation, which is very authentic. And leadership exists within jazz. For those that haven't seen it, you may be aware that certain musicians take solos at different times. Yeah. They, if you like, are becoming the leader, and they're moving towards the front and taking that role where the others then follow him or her. But the connection and the leadership is happening through the social process of the conversation between them.
So it's actually being lived, again, to use one of the phrases from the book, in the moment. It's actually, leadership is happening real time on a fairly spontaneous basis, or is it planned, or is it?
It's as spontaneous as this conversation. So in fact, we don't have a script. Yeah. So, but we have an idea of what we want to talk about, and so this conversation is spontaneous, using the grammar and vocabulary of our language. Jazz is the same, so there will be, if you like, a theme that we want to address, but it is very spontaneous. It is very much in the moment. And I think what I like about the themes in the book, getting connected, moving to getting real, you can see I've read the book, is that what happens in any conversation, as in this one now, or in a musical conversation, is that you can't predict what's going to happen, and you have to be leading and following in the moment to be able to react in real time.
How do you do that as a jazz musician? Then you're playing away. How do you know what to do next?
Because what we're trying to do, I suppose, is have a beautiful conversation, make a beautiful sound, and so we're led by the value, if you like, the emotional value that comes out from the sound that we make collectively together. So we don't know what to do other than in the moment, if it sounds good to us, collectively we build on it. So something will happen in the conversation, and then collectively we build on that together.
But is there some notional leadership? So, if you've organised the gig, for example, so you called three colleagues together, does that make you a sort of nominal leader? So you would kind of give the nod and...
I think maybe the leader only in terms of the logistics. I've arranged the gig. But when we start playing the music, then the leadership function will only be mine when I'm playing a piano solo, because I'm the piano player. Right. But then at some time in the piece of music, a guitar or a saxophone will take the lead, and they become the leader, or the drummer, or the bassist, and so on. And when that happens, again, it's not predictable, because there just comes a time when it feels that I should pass the leadership baton to someone else, and they pick up that challenge willingly, normally with just a nod of their heads. So it could go anywhere else into the organisation, into the group. But in the moment, I'll look at, if you were the bass player, I'd look at you and you say, I'm ready for this now.
So my assumption is you've got to be pretty aware of each other as you're playing. It's no good kind of shutting your eyes and going into some dream world of your own music. You must have to be quite tuned into each other, sort of thing.
Yeah, to us, again, it goes back to your comment about being in the moment. So if there are 4 of us in the band, we have to be fully present and in the moment all the time, as we should in every conversation that we have.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
as we know, in reality, we can be distracted. If you're in a jazz group and you get distracted, then the sound, the collective sound, can actually start to fall apart. So we have to be listening very, very deeply.
And that's really
all the time.
interesting in terms of organisations, because how much of the time do people actually listen? You know, I mean, my experience is not very often. You know, we've got one ear on what's being said, and we've got another ear on what we're overhearing outside. We've got a third ear wondering what's going on with my iPhone, and another one looking at something on the table.
And the fifth ear, I have a lot of ears there, is saying, I'm listening to this conversation, kind of, but I want to say something really important. So I'm just waiting for my time to say this really amazing thing. And as you let go of the context of what's really happening, then if you do get the chance to say your amazing thing, it's probably out of context and doesn't fit with what went before.
Land properly somehow, yeah.
And that could happen in music, in theory, because if you were thinking, I'm going to play this great thing in a moment, you've stopped listening to the context.
So you have to stay connected, really, all the time.
Yeah, and it means that in terms of getting real, if something goes wrong or the unexpected happens, you have a much better ability to deal with error or uncertainty, because things change. And in organisations, we like to have plans, but this is the real world. The real world is messy. I love this mess around us. And jazz musicians are very good at dealing with the mess, because we find value. And also, I think, to get real and to be connected, we have this thing whereby we try to suspend our judgment about what's right or wrong for a while, which I think is a little bit different to the way that we can be in reality.
Yeah, the habit, I guess, in many conversations is to find 5 reasons why something won't work before you can find one why it might work. And your invitation, as I hear you in jazz, is to say, oh, that's not what I expected, but let's go with it.
Yes,
let's explore it. Let's see where it takes us. And maybe at some point we'll have to kind of shuffle back into something else, but we'll go and explore it.
And the key way of doing that, which is part of the improvisational mindset in jazz and in theatre and in comedy, is to hold back from being overly critical too soon, so that you play with an idea, even if your initial thought might be, that sounds like a terrible idea, and in reality, in conversation, you might say, yes, but I don't like that, and let's move on to something else. In jazz or in stand-up comedy, it's the same thing. When something comes along which is unexpected, we collectively accept whatever has come, because that's the only thing that's there, and there may be something really fantastic within that new idea, even though it's unexpected, even if it's an error. I mean, it depends what you define as an error.
Yeah.
But that's not to say you shouldn't judge it eventually. That's the key thing. In real life, we don't suspend judgment so much, and we move to criticise and judge very quickly. We're almost taught to be that way.
We're trained, aren't we, from birth?
Yeah, that's right.
To find a problem, yeah.
So the jazz way is to say, just hold back, get real. Let's see what's in the mess, and let's find value in it.
One theme I find quite interesting is the kind of skills aspect. So, in order to behave in the way you're describing as a jazz musician, the musician presumably has to have put in years of training, of practice, to be confident that they'll be able to play what is required, and they're not kind of worried about, oh my goodness, there's going to be a key change here, I don't know what it'll be, and I won't be able to follow it. So, and I think somehow leadership's a bit the same. You have to have the confidence in your own ability to be able to relax into going with the flow.
Yes.
Yeah, is that a reasonable?
It is. As I said before, I think if you think of our skill in a linguistic parallel, then we've learned how to speak the language and interact with each other. Although the conversation in a quartet is 4 people talking simultaneously, which is a little bit of a challenge, because we tend to take it in turns. But it reminded me, in the book you talk about zones of choice.
Yeah.
And one of the themes is about self-belief, where you talk about this paradox of being strong and also admitting to your vulnerabilities or your weak areas or your demons. So in a sense, it's a paradox, because you have to, again, this is what I'm reading in your book, but I feel it as a musician, is that you have to be strong and confident in your own ability, but you also have to acknowledge that you have maybe some areas of weakness that need to be improved upon. And so in a conversation, a musical conversation, a piece, at times we'll be feeling strong and confident and we know what's happening, but it's a complex conversation, so there'll be times, well, I suppose even getting lost in the conversation, which can happen within a piece of music. And so you then may feel quite vulnerable and exposed.
By being authentic and demonstrating that vulnerability, the emotion in that enables someone else to collect you and pick you up almost in a musical sense, I guess, in terms of if you're wandering off in the wrong direction, someone will kind of wander after you and help you back on track.
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, it reminds me of, from the book, this reference to generosity.
Yeah.
So it's about seeking help when you need it, but offering help as well when you see others need it. And there is a generosity of spirit within the jazz group, in that we want each other to be good collectively. If you're the drummer, I want you to sound as good as you can be. So we are supporting you all the time. We're supporting each other. So there is this generosity of spirit. And does that happen in a team where you can see one person is flagging a bit? I guess it depends on the culture of the organisation and the people involved. But in some worlds, the weak member may be discarded and not cared for. In our world, we would, if we're in the moment and on stage and we've got 600 people watching us, we certainly have a vested interest in making sure that we look after each other and we're generous.
There's also something about how you define success, because, again, my assumption is a jazz musician has no interest at all in looking absolutely brilliant personally in a poor overall performance. There's no advantage to that, is there? You want everybody to succeed. You want to succeed individually, so you want your solo to kind of stand out and be good, but you want everyone else to be good as well. And I think that's what happens in the best teams, actually. People have this shared sense of responsibility. Yeah, I want to do a good job and I want recognition for that, but it's equally important to me that everyone else succeeds.
Yes, well, quite right. And particularly if you want to get booked again.
You want another job.
At the jazz club.
And it's interesting, isn't it? That's also true in the world of work, actually. If we just kind of make the comparison, you want another gig, well, you better do a good job collectively, otherwise you'll be out.
Yeah, exactly right. I was thinking then about some of the other zones of choice that you were talking about. Are there any particular ones that I liked? I liked the idea of direction, and again, it's a paradox in that you're suggesting, I think, in the book that at one level you acknowledge the limits that you have as an organisation, or in terms of what it is you do, how you design and manufacture your products and services, and yet the other side of the coin is about, I think you call it, imagining a better future. And I like this as well because they seem to be two different mindsets. And in jazz, we work to structure all the time, within which there could be harmonic limits and rhythmical limits of when what you do inside a piece of music. But the whole essence of improvisation and about disruption, which I haven't spoken about yet, which we love in jazz, is to create an alternative reality or this imagined future. Maybe that's not clear in terms of jazz speak, but essentially in terms of jazz, we work with our structure, but we use that as a canvas on top of which to improvise. And we're simultaneously following the rules and breaking the rules at the same time. Now, I don't know what the parallel might be in terms of the way you've engaged with that in the book.
Well, it's an interesting observation around how much structure is there in your work and how much innovation, improvisation, freedom is there. And I guess in the jazz environment there'd be quite a lot of freedom. There is a structure, you're playing in a particular key and you've probably got some chord sequence in the back of your mind, but above and beyond that there's a lot of freedom.
Yes.
Well,
whereas
in the world of work it might be almost the opposite. You've got quite a lot of structure and a little bit of freedom as to how you
I think in the world of work, you can look at your responsibilities today, if you like,
Yeah.
and so there are certain laws or procedures or systems that you're working within in your sector, but I think this is about the imagined future. Even though we're mostly operating in the moment, there are things that we do in the moment that create alternative futures, and if this is to do with product design, if
So that's the link between the here and the future almost. It's not they're two separate things. It's one emerges from
being in the moment,
being in the moment,
but in a more disruptive way. So I think it's again it's a little bit paradoxical, because if you look at jazz has changed. People often phone me up and say, "Hi Alex, we'd like you to play jazz at our birthday party or wedding," and I say, "Okay, what is jazz?" Is that a philosophical question? No, I don't say that. I say, what kind of jazz do you like? And it tends to be kind of decade specific, and this is the interesting thing. So there's jazz of the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and it almost as a genre, it does reinvent itself every decade. There's always a different sound that happens, even though it's all still called jazz. And that's this thing about innovation and disruption within the genre itself, not just within one song, but the whole art form continues to adapt and to change all through time, which of course is the way that industry works.
Well, it's certainly the way that I think leadership works. I think if some aspects of leadership are exactly the same now as they were if you were a centurion in the Roman army.
Yes.
And yet other things have changed. So we've talked about the importance of teamwork and listening and collaborating and tuning in and all that sort of stuff, but I'm interested in the solo. What makes a good solo?
That's a profound question, and it's at the heart of what jazz is all about. It's when an individual has the chance to really express themselves. So whilst I'm making a solo on the piano, I'm trying to, as I say, to craft this lovely sound which makes sense in the context of what my colleagues are saying, my fellow musicians, who, if I'm taking a solo, they're there in a supporting role, but they're, again, with generosity of spirit and collectively making me sound great, which I'm very grateful for. And the reason I'm doing this is also to connect with the audience, because they've come along to listen to some great music. And I think what is the sign of any great music of any genre? It's the ability to emotionally connect and if you like, move the listener so they feel happy, or if it's the blues, maybe a little bit more reflective, these kind of things.
To what extent do you kind of try and play something that's pretty close to the underlying pattern and structure of the music, and to what extent do you kind of go right off on one and just kind of get out there and do something completely radical and revolutionary?
It's another one of these paradoxes, I think, right. In that it's both and. And I remember a few years ago at the Cheltenham Jazz Festival, I went to see the famous saxophonist Lee Konitz, and he was running a masterclass for musicians, and he spoke from a jazz point of view about something similar, in that he envisaged a scale, if you like. So number one represented the original melody in its pure form. That's the thing that we can all sing along to when we go, I know that song. And he was critical actually of some younger musicians, because he said, when I hear you play your solo, you jump straight to number 10. So this nice thing, and then they start going, they fly off to the extreme. And there is value in getting to number 10, but his message was, why don't you build up? So go from 1 to 2, explore that, and then go from 2 to 3, and take small steps until you get there. And so he actually challenged some of these musicians to try that. And he found actually that some of the musicians couldn't even play at 1, because they were kind of guessing what the original melody was. And I suppose there are parallels with that in the real world. We want to be pushing the boundaries all the time, but there has to be sensitivity. Also, I think if you're respectful of the listener, because you don't want to lose your customer base, if you like. So you need to, I think there is a requirement to keep pushing things. John Coltrane, of course, composed that very famous song called Giant Steps. Sometimes, as a musician, we take bigger steps, if not giant. But we just have to be careful about how far we push people, because I think it feels uncomfortable to the listener.
In the world of work, I think this is interesting to explore in terms of how do you get your ideas accepted? How do you get your your suggestion, your creative breakthrough? How do you make it palatable? How do you make it easier for people to understand? And if you come out with something that's completely revolutionary, people sort of look at you and say, you're bonkers, that would never work in our environment. And I think it's an interesting parallel with the solo, where you actually need to start where people are and gradually take them to something that's kind of radical and different. And because you're taking them on a bit of a journey with you, when you get there, they say, oh, I see, that's where that might fit in, and we might be able to adapt this to that and the other.
It relates to what we've said before about the issues within a piece and then the evolution of the genre. So that rings true to me in both those ways. So within a piece, you're bringing your musicians and the listeners with you. But over time as well, I mean, there are a string of great innovators in jazz that have changed what jazz is in terms of its, if you like, again, as a language, the way it's put together. So everyone talks about Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Bill Evans and many others, from the 60s onwards.
So they would even challenge the underlying structure and said,
well,
we don't have to play in the same key. We can change halfway through, or we can play in an odd tempo, or we can...
Yeah, completely.
And everyone would have said, but you can't do that.
Well, many people react, and the great Ornette Coleman just died a couple of weeks ago, and he was very controversial in his time. Yeah. And even I still listen to him now and go, wow, what? It's quite challenging. But there are others who've persevered, and they know that this disruption, this innovation is uncomfortable, not really for them, but for those around them, the Mavericks. And yet they have such self-belief and self-confidence that they stick with it because they want to demonstrate to the world around them that this thing has value. And so Miles and Monk and Coltrane and so on, they did this, and jazz musicians to this very day continue to do it. And it makes some of the audience a little bit unhappy. And I think Miles Davis himself said, he often go to gigs. He was one that changed his own sound every decade. And he'd go to the concert and people would say, can you play that song from that album in 1959? He said, no, that's what I did then, and now I've got another thing, and I want you to hear that instead.
I think this relates very clearly to innovation in an organisational context, because you need people who are a bit different and who might think creatively and come up with a radical option or idea. But you've also got to have a team or a group of people who are prepared to go with that, who are prepared to follow it, because just like in a jazz band, if someone starts going off on a very radical tangent and the others stop playing and say, hey, you can't do that, you've lost your innovation. And it's the same with the world of work. You have to have people who are prepared to say, I hadn't thought of that and I don't really understand it, but let's go with it for a while.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think what I was saying before was that sometimes the Mavericks can sometimes make the customer uncomfortable, but the team around the Maverick or the collection of Mavericks has to be connected again, back to getting connected, because otherwise it can't happen. So if you look at innovators in the real world, the non-jazz world, again around them there will have been people,
tight supporters who will help them through this period of because organisations are very good at stopping innovation. Yeah, I remember listening to the chief executive of Renault talk a good few years ago now. And Renault, love them or hate them, we all have our views on car brands. They have innovated over the years. They've introduced new categories of vehicle, like the people carrier, the first one to Renault, and the kind of mini car, the Renault Twingo was the first one of its kind. And he talked about how he had to protect the team that was designing this from all the normal organisational control processes. Otherwise, they would just have suffocated. They'd have been killed at birth.
That's a great story, isn't it? So every organisation needs that protection.
Yeah, and so
I guess so as jazz musicians, we do that live and in the moments, and we don't often have that kind of protection. It's make it or break it in the moment.
In the moment, you raise another point, which is you pretty much out there as a jazz musician, and you're doing your best, you're doing your stuff, and you have your internal measure of success or failure. You know whether you've played a good gig or not, or whether you think it's going well. But ultimately, it's the audience who are the judge. So you're kind of very exposed there, aren't you? And you kind of, if people start throwing rotten fruit at you, or booing, or whistling, that's pretty challenging. And in a way, I think leadership's a bit like that. You're kind of out there on your own to a certain extent, and you have to be in tune to the feedback you're getting, but you mustn't be led by the nose by it, because you have to maintain this, and it's another of these paradoxes of, I've got to have the confidence to believe in what I'm doing, and I must be making sure that I'm getting feedback and that it's connecting with people.
Yeah.
But you can't just follow, you have to lead, you have to kind of
That's right.
take the initiative sometimes, and it can feel a bit exposed, just like, I guess, being a jazz musician.
It reminds me too, that comment, some people may be critical of jazz in that they say, oh, you guys just play for yourselves, and it doesn't matter what the audience is thinking, you're just having fun, aren't you? And there are different schools of thought about that. I think some pure artists, whatever the art form is, might be saying, yeah, I'm doing this because I'm expressing myself. Yeah. And if it was an artist and everyone else hated this stuff, I guess there's some value in this thing. But as a business, it's not going to be very good, because you're not going to sell any paintings. And some people were, when they looked at Miles Davis in his later years, they were conscious of the fact that he often used to play with his back towards the audience as well, and which some people thought was disrespectful. And I think that for me, I guess I can talk more about myself, when I'm performing collectively or as a solo musician, it's very important, that connection with the audience. And one of the themes of the Zones of Choice is about relationships, isn't it? It's about getting close whilst maintaining your distance. I think that makes sense as a leader.
Theme there, isn't it? Yeah.
Although I would say that for jazz, within the jazz group, we have to stay close all the time. I'm not sure it's actually possible to maintain a distance in that organism.
So maybe the parallel is better with the audience. So you have to have a sense of how the music is landing with the audience, whether they're liking it or understanding it or just being moved by it, or whether it's just going over their heads. So in that sense you have to be close, but you also have to maintain a certain distance, because you're leading them, not vice versa.
That's right. That's really interesting, isn't it? So it may be uncomfortable. So you have for them.
Yeah.
So as it is with all the innovations, so the customer may say, I liked it the way it was. I don't feel comfortable now. But I guess if you get have too much empathy with the audience, you'll say, oh, let's not innovate so much then. And so equally, I think as jazz musicians, we can push the boundaries and maybe maintain a little bit of distance from them, because we know they're not going to be happy for a while until they get used to this new vibe. I like that.
That reminds me of a concert I went to recently, actually. It's not jazz music, but the guy actually explicitly said, the leader of the band said, I know you've come to listen to the songs you know and love, but bear with us, we're going to play some tracks off our new album first, enjoy them, and then we'll play the ones you know and love. And I thought that was quite interesting, actually, because that's exactly what people kind of... And if he hadn't positioned it that clearly, I mean, obviously people would have put up with it and maybe enjoyed it, but I think that made it even more likely for the new material to be appreciated. People kind of relax into it. Oh, yeah.
And in that example, the band is introducing, if you like, a new product range. Jazz is a little bit different in that we take the same product and we reinterpret it every time we perform the song. So if people say, I want to hear the song the same way as it sounded on that album by Keith Jarrett in 1972, well, it's impossible for us to do, because we don't memorize things in that way. We don't memorize anything. It's like when we have a conversation, we don't memorize the words that we're about to use as a script. So if you like it the way it was on the record you bought, you probably would be disappointed at the jazz gig. But that's not what jazz audiences expect. They know that you're going to be there to take a fresh look at this song that's been played thousands of times before. That's the essence of jazz, this ability to say, you know, how else can we manufacture and deliver this thing to an audience? Because it's unlimited amounts of possibilities. The art of the possible, I think, was your phrase about getting real.
Yeah.
And there are lots of those possibilities.
Thank you for the time and the conversation, Alex. It's really interesting exploring these ideas with you. It's always a pleasure. And now we'll go and have a go at doing some of this real time.
Okay.
And we'll give people an opportunity to experience what it's like being in a jazz band to a certain extent, recognizing that they're not jazz musicians.
Perfect. Let's do it.
Okay, thank you.